let's take a look at 3 Cloudhammer Steelworks Katanas with deep Sori, sexy curvature in the blades, sent graciously by John of RVA Katana. John is a published author and runs a katana shop out of Richmond, Virginia. He has also a successful channel on both YouTube and TikTok about knowledge on historical swords. Highly recommended, link in the description below. In this video, we're going to compare this katana to other swords in history and discuss the impact their different geometries have on the handling characteristics. There will be copious amount of test cutting and some stress tests done to evaluate the durability of these swords, purportedly made out of Japanese super steel that has a superior edge tension and resistance to lateral tension. You can see here, these are definitely not your box standard Longquan katanas with the standard curvature. Features some very pronounced sexy curvature in the blades and in the hilts. And this one over here with some more standard curvature in the blade and the hilt as a comparison. Now, Cloudhammer Steelworks is a sword making company formed by Taiwanese businessman Nangong Cheng'an. I'll link his Facebook profile here, and you can check out the photos showcasing these swords. They have 2 principal forges, one situated in Vietnam, specialized in making monosteel su-hardened blades used on these katanas. The other one in Heian, northwestern China, for differentially hardened clay-tempered blades. They specialize in katanas, but also Chinese swords, Middle Eastern and European swords. Usually they feature some distinctive blade geometries, such as these blades with deep Sori, but also fittings that are somewhat unique. Their strong suit is the durability of their su-hardened blades and the level of fit and finish, which we'll look at in a second. Now, katanas with this degree of curvature, especially this one, with a non-linear distribution of curvature from the tan to the blade, are extremely rare on today's reproduction market. You can say they are probably 1 in 100, 1 in 1,000 chance to be found. Mostly they are more like these very standard slight curvature in the blade with a mostly straight hilt. So, of course, that replicates the Uchi-katana style katana found in the Shinto and the Shinshinto period of sword making in Japan. But we have to recognize that blades and tan with deep Soris are the most iconic ones in Japanese sword making history. And you can say this one over here is probably more stereotypical to the koto, meaning the old saber period of sword making in Japan. And this one down below has even a deeper curvature in the blade, but it's more uniformly distributed in the blade and the tan. Now let's go back in history for a second. Prior to the Heian period in Japanese history, most blades have a straight blade, like this one over here. Now this is a Chinese example, but Japanese swords are identical to the Chinese ones. From great finds and collection at certain treasury houses in Japan, these swords were revered and preserved in Japanese temples for over 1,000 years. Now, starting from the 9th and 10th century, due to the decline of the Chinese Tang Dynasty, Japanese culture experienced an awakening, let's say, in its national pride. Now, the Kokufu Bunka is nationalist style or domestic style culture movement had given life to many new styles of art and craftsmanship in Japan. Notably, sword making is one of the areas that has experienced this newfound nationalist style. This caused the sword to go through a period that experiments differential hardening with clay hammering First, when you heat up the blade, it gets softer, and you use clay to cover the spine of the blade before you quench it in low temperature water. That causes the edge to become more hardened than the spine, giving the edge more edge retention. But since the spine is soft, the blade tends to bend under stress rather than break. Now, this process has given its natural curvature in the blade as this part of the blade expand. Now, if you look at 11th century Japanese sword making, which is typically considered as the height of sword making in Japanese history, notably the 5 swords called the Tenka Goken, the 5 swords under heaven, made by 5 different illustrious Japanese swordsmiths during that period, almost all feature this very distinct curvature of a somewhat deep Sori, but having the most amount of curvature in the lower 1/3 of the blade and at the transition to the tan. If you look at this grip over here, it's extremely curved, especially in the center. Now, this trend is probably influenced by the Immish people, the shrimp barbarian. Even though they fought the Japanese imperial authority for hundreds of years and eventually got assimilated and generally considered as a primary enemy of the imperial Japanese people, their culture had a significant influence on the imperial culture as well. Now, the Immish people's swords typically feature a curvature mostly in the lower portion of the blade and at the transition to the tan. And sometimes they are called the kanuki kata, meaning the hair tweezer style sword, especially with a perforation in the tan. In the late Heian period, Japanese swordsmiths adopt this feature in the sword making, resulting in this very distinct look in their swords. Of course, nihonto evolved later. Most of them took on a more straight profile, but still, many of these koto style tashis are still being made, just mounted to uchi katana style mounting, such as this one. And you can see the mounting is distinctively the later uchi katana or the katana style mounting rather than the tashi style. If you compare this to a straight blade, you can see how much the blade kicks back, and also with this very curved handle. Now, this has a very dramatic impact on the usage of this kind of sword. See how much the blade is canted away from the grip. If I hold my offhand and the main hand in alignment, you can see the blade is curving away significantly from this axis. See, what happens to my forearm is that when I hit the target, I felt simultaneously that I was hit myself on the forearm. So this is what happens. See, where this grip has a differentially curved contour than the rest of the blade. If you extend your wrist to this degree, normally it wouldn't be a problem, but now look at the pommel can hit my forearm, so essentially bam. Now, with the straight blade and the straight handle, you can expect to hold the sword this way, usually canted backward slightly, so you can pass the sword forward to accelerate the blade, especially in the foible region, this area just below the tip. It carries significant amount of kinetic energy due to the angular speed of the blade. Now, to fully accelerate the blade, you tend to chamber the sword blade back a little bit before you swing, as this is a very instinctive move by the swordsman, because you want a greater distance for the sword blade to fully accelerate when it makes the impact. A deeply curved blade, especially one in the handle, has a different effect. If you see, when I line up my both hands on this deeply curved handle, the blade kicks back naturally. It already almost rests on my shoulder, and all I have to do is just cast it forward, and I don't need to bring it back further, although I can. I already enjoy a sizable distance. If you do a direct comparison, line up the blade here You see, I have to bring the blade back somewhat to have the similar amount of distance to accelerate the blade. Obviously, you still have to be careful when you land on the target or make a contact with the opponent's blade when you parry, because the blade tends to rest at a different angle. If you extend your wrist forward, it will naturally be straight and aligned with your arm with a straight blade. However, with a curved blade, you can see it's canted backwards. The beneficial part of this feature is that you naturally incorporate more slicing motion. However, you have to be careful as the blade makes a contact. The area might not be parallel to the part of the blade. It has two implications. Other than incorporating more slicing in the cut, it can mean that when you do a parry against your opponent's blade, their blade is more inclined to blow through the bind and have the tip directly threatening you. So you have to bring this blade a little bit forward with extra effort, right? If I have to achieve the same blade alignment, all I have to do is to bring my hands here, and to do the same, I have to do this. Because the handle curves backward, I can't bring it into my forearm, so I have to bring it down a little bit. This introduced new challenges, but also new benefits in the usage of the swords. Later period of Tashi has a more uniform curvature in the blade and tan, so that has some even more different implication in the usage. Even though you can incorporate more slicing motion as it makes contact with the surface, you see that a curved blade has less contact area, meaning that the force is concentrated in a smaller area. This small contact area has a drawing effect. You draw across the surface of the opponent's body. So this will be more deadly, causing a longer wound. Not necessarily deeper, but generally speaking, longer. And it can sever more muscle, cause more bleeding, even though it's not necessarily cutting deeper. And in test cutting, I found some very profound characteristics with this sword by having this distinct deep curvature. They tend to cut very well, but you do have to calculate the distance appropriately. Otherwise, you could just nick the target with the tip of your blade. You see that a straight blade would naturally cleave into the target, and it has a greater reach. You can see that. Same blade length will cause a curved blade to have less reach. You have to extend it a little bit further, especially if you do not rotate the blade and the tan as much, because this part of the blade, pretty much the pommel, can collide with your forearm. So you always have to be careful with that. And that means that you have to bring in your body further in to do this slicing cut. I have to give Cloudhammer prop that this feature is rarely found on reproduction swords, even though this is the most recognizable feature in nihonto. If you enjoy experimenting with the usage of historical swords, you definitely check out Cloudhammer's Steelworks Japanese sword offering, as some of them do indeed carry this very distinct curvature, and you have several styles of swords to choose from. Now let's put these swords through their paces and see how different it is to use these deeply curved swords in cutting. Wow. Look at how clean this is. Deep Sori Katana. Some good slicing motion here. Yeah, didn't even fall down. I felt the impact though. Wow. Look at the sharpness now. Slice towel, but not very smooth, not very sharp. Okay, look at the change of sharpness later. Now I'm gonna test the edge holding ability and the resistance to lateral bending of these three swords. For this, I chose the trunk of a cut down tree as the target, given that these blades are made of Japanese 2 steel, known for its resilience. Now, as you can see here, I launch about 3 to 4 scores of strikes with medium power against the tree trunk. Right, 3 things immediately stood out to me. Number 1 is that these blades are made of mono-tempered spring steel, which is the same as the one for the longsword blade made by Cloudhammer, sent to me for review, which I'm gonna release very soon. But unlike the longsword blades, these katana blades are made in traditional geometries that's very thick and only has a very slight amount of distal taper, so they are rigid throughout. This means that they do not flex nearly as much as European swords, and they do not really absorb the shock. So while hitting the large immovable object like the tree trunk, I felt a lot of hand shock. Not the most comfortable experience, but the sword held up. Nothing really loosened up, including the tsuba, which I'll talk about later, that came loose, right? Number 2 is that the edge retention is quite good as advertised. These blades are tempered to 57 HRC, so quite hard, but not really brittle. There's no chipping at all, no edge deformation, and the lateral smack on the tree trunks didn't cause any deformation. And the blade flexed into a curve when smacked, but went back to true. I didn't do any further destructive testing because these swords were supposed to be returned as long swords, so I couldn't just downright destroy them. But as far as I could see, these are extremely durable. And sharpness, and on the edge, a little taller than before. Take a damn towel. Yeah, it slides just as before. You can see here. Yeah, no problem. So I polish up, clean up the edge, and yeah, it just slides as before. So edge holding ability definitely is a plus for this sword, even though it's a little bit clumsy. After tapping on the side of the trees, you can see the blade remains perfectly straight. And the spine and the edge, the differentially hardened blade would have been bent. You can see it's perfectly straight. There's the edge, the spine. And the final observation is that these swords have different handling characteristics. Although katana are not the most lively swords in the world for their sizes, these 3 have different handling traits. Right? The one with the differential curvature is the most lively, followed by the one with the uniform deep Sori. And the one with the center curvature with the Musashi ring tsuba is the least favorable in terms of handling. Now we're gonna explore a little bit of the reason as of why. Now I compare their handling traits side by side to a Chinese sword made by L.K. Chan based on an 8th century original housed at the Todaiji Temple in Nara, Japan. This is not a fair comparison as no later period Japanese designs have the same lively handling characteristics as these Tang Dynasty Chinese swords. Obviously, the indigenous iron supply in Japan could not afford the steel quality for these Chinese designs with greater degree of distal taper, but Japanese didn't want to rely on imported steel, so they had to use indigenous steel in an efficient way. Therefore, making thick blades with little distal taper is the way to go. Still, if you look at the distal taper of these swords made of well-heat-treated modern tool steel, the one with the differential curvature has the most degree of distal taper, along with a deep bohea that reduces a lot of weight from the blade. There's no surprise that it's relatively lightweight and quite nimble. While the sword with a deep and uniform Sori doesn't have any bohea in the blade, it still has a good amount of distal taper to feel somewhat maneuverable. And the Musashi Ring center curvature katana is my least favorite one in terms of handling, given that the blade is quite hefty. You can see that from the base to the midpoint, there's not a lot of distal taper at all. And only from the midpoint onward, it takes on increased distal taper that reduces the thickness drastically. So the upper portion of the blade carries more distal taper than an average katana, while the lower portion carries less. So this results in the blade feeling somewhat meso-heavy, meaning that the middle chunk of the blade has more mass than the standard katana. So while it's definitely not an overweight and clumsy sword, it simply doesn't have a lot of grace in handling. Of course, that also has something to do with a modest degree of niku in the blade, making it more durable than the other two katana. But also the Musashi Ring tsuba design that reduces a lot of weight from the hilt. So the sword has a pretty far pointed balance at 5 3/4 inches from the hilt. Since the upper portion has more distal taper, it's not exactly very top heavy, but the blade has enormous amount of presence. Double cuts are not exactly difficult, but I wouldn't say I enjoy handling the sword more than any other katana I have. What it lacks in handling department, it makes up with excellent durability, right? With the extra niku, no bohea in the blade, just a very solid chunk of steel. Here you can see the other two katanas handle with noticeably easier acceleration and redirection. I think it's kind of poetic that the modern Japanese tool steel enables the maker to incorporate more evenly distributed, greater degree of distal and profile taper than most historical katanas, which were made the way they were due to the laborious and difficult processes that yield suitable blade steel from indigenous iron supplies. Now, Cloudhammer steelworks usually use 3 varieties of steels on their hardened blades. That's S7, which is extremely durable. Now, the owner of Cloudhammer had done some extensive testing on durability. He pitted his own S7 blades against other typical T10 blades as a Chinese tool steel, very common on today's reproduction market, and find that S7 has better edge retention, but much greater durability. And this was verified by Master Jensen, who had done over 100 destruction tests. The point of the destruction blades is not to break the sword, it's just push the sword to the point of failure and see how long it lasts. Now, when you use a very consistent methodology, it can tell you the maximum durability of blades. Now, Cloudhammer Katana uses S7 blade is the most durable blade so far tested by Master Jensen among over 100 swords. So that tells you something. The other sword steel used by their Suharden forge is 6150, also known as 51 CRV4 blades, which is very common for European sword blades. It's not very hard, even though you can harden it to Rockwell scale C of 52 to 55. Now, making a sword less hard will naturally extend its durability, generally speaking. If you do those test cutting, mostly targeting tatami mats, bottles, pool noodles, you don't really need that extreme amount of edge retention. Now, this one is made of SX105V, which is a Japanese tool steel. Carbon content is equivalent to that of 1086. Now, it also has some manganese, silicon, chromium in the blade, so it has a very good overall, very balanced property, has good edge retention, good hardenability due to the introduction of manganese, but also the silicon makes the blade a little bit durable when it flexes. Chromium obviously will increase some corrosion resistance, even though I find that on these blades, if you don't coat them with a very uniform layer of protective oil, they tend to rust a little bit. So be careful of that. Now let's look at the fit and finish of these swords. Cloudhammer Steelworks do not name their models, as they don't do stock models, not even numbered models. They just make whatever swords they want and fit it with furniture pieces, whatever they have in hand. Now I'm gonna call this katana with less Sori the Musashi ring, as it features an antique brass Musashi ring style tsuba and some bamboo mat style fushikashira. And I'm gonna call this one the Dragon Tashi, as it has a deep Sori, more uniformly distributed Sori, but has a dragon tsuba, also made of antique brass, some dragon motif in the fushikashira as well, blue leather ito wrapping. And this one I'm gonna call it the Plum Blossom, as it has a Tashi style tsuba and with some fushikashira feature. Plum Blossom, Cloudhammer Steelworks, formerly known as Bizer, is known for their excellent fit and finish. Now, is that true on all three of these swords? Kind of. If you look at the mounting style, they are all in katana style mounting. Now let's first take a look at this Dragon Tachi with more uniform deep Sori. It has antique brass fitting of dragon, definitely cast. The casting quality is mediocre. I can make out the dragon scale and their claws, heads, but nothing very eye-catching at all. It feels a little bit more generic. Definitely the least favorite among all three of these swords. But you do get a bang of your buck in terms of clarity, the crispness, the definition on the lines on the fushikashira. As you can see on the kashira, the dragon is well defined, and on the fuji, not only there's a dragon flying in the sky, you also see some clouds. The dragon motif manukis rests on the finger side of the tsuka. Casting quality is a little muddier than the fushikashira, but that's okay because they are mostly covered by the leather ito. Now the part I enjoy the most is the leather wrapping of ito on the tsuka. They are fairly uniform. The diamonds are mostly uniform. Leather feels very tight and firm. The ito wrapping, the knots are extremely tight. It's very difficult to move them around. And the transition to the fushikashira is mostly flush. There's only a ledge at the kashira, the end cap. You can catch on a finger, but I doubt you'll feel this when you handle the sword. There's genuine same stingray leather wrap under the ito. They're lacquered. I don't like their appearance, but they're okay. Feels a little bit flat as panel, and you can see the edges of the panel. I prefer the tsuka wooden core to have an inlay to inset these two panels of stingray skin, but it's okay. It doesn't really feel jarring in any way. And one thing I have to comment on is the circumference of the tsuka is quite extreme. Now, you know that handweight swords are usually referred to as having axe handle. They're pretty bulky without too much tapering. Now, if you look at this handle, it's almost as wide as handweight tsuka. But if you flip to this dimension, oh boy, it's also thick. So they're quite girthy. If you have long and bony fingers, you probably enjoy this very thick, girthy handle. Otherwise, it feels a little less grippy, but the leather wrapping on the ito, on the tsuka, makes it rather comfortable. And I watched several reviews by other people on the internet, Matthew Jensen, Alien Jude. They all enjoyed the leather ito wrapping on Cloudhammer Steelworks swords. I have to say that its antique blue color on the leather looks rather nice. It's quite tasteful. Now the yellowish brass fitting has a good contrast with a leather ito, but it just feels a little weird. I don't enjoy this very yellow brass. Maybe antique them a little bit more will make them more appealing.
Now the habaki and the seppa are made of different alloy, probably nickel plated. They have a silvery sheen on them. I have to say that they don't look particularly unique, and the seppa fit to the tsuba's pedestal to receive the seppa is mostly flush. I can feel a little bit of edge on one side, but not too much on the other side. And the fit of these parts are extremely tight. There's no movement in the tsuba or the tsuka, so it's well executed. And the habaki fit to the blade is very tight. Although you can see a little bit of gap, we can probably see that this habaki is made for blades with certain degree of niku, so there's some convex geometry. But this blade obviously doesn't have any niku at all. Now, it's a good thing for smooth cutting, as they are very confident in the durability of their swords, so they don't really need to add extra muscle in the edge bevel to enhance it. This reduces some weight from the sword blade. That's always a good thing for handling, but also it makes the edge angle a little bit smaller, so it assists the cutting performance. Overall, I like fit and finish and the tsuka wrapping. I think the tsuka can be a little less girthy, maybe reduce either the width or the thickness a little bit, but overall, it's not a big problem. If you look at the blade, you can see that all the edges are pretty uniform. There's no rippling on the blade. You run your finger down the blade, you can detect very little rippling. It's not the most flat and well-polished blade. As you can see, it just basically hybrid polish between mirror and satin, which is good, as these are mono steel, hardened blades, are mostly used for tameshigiri. So you don't want a high polish that's easily diminished. Obviously, it doesn't have any hamon because it's hardened. Now, if you flex the blade, you can see there's a little bit flex, not much, because katanas are pretty beefy in the blade. You can look at the base of the blade. It's at 7.1 millimeters thick. That's not extremely thick. It's okay, and tapers down. Pretty standard tapering in the thickness to the midpoint, and then they dramatically taper down in thickness in the top half of the blade. And this is true for all three katanas by Cloudhammer Steelworks. They tend to taper much more in the upper portion of the blade. So near the tip, they're thinner than most production katanas you see on the market. And also, they have about 1/3 of profile taper, so the width of the blade is about 2/3 as the base. It's a fairly standard mass distribution on blades, a little bit better than the standard katana reproduced in China. It just means that typically they are thinner than most antique katanas, but obviously having a very reliable steel, you can have more confidence in the durability to make the blade overall less beefy. Now this plum blossom tachi, if you look at this blade's mounting, you can see it has a very standard brass habaki, and the fit is fairly good. And even though the spine of the blade sticks out maybe a 0.5 millimeter, maybe not even that, but mostly it's flush. There's no gap in the transition. The fit to the seppa from the habaki side is pretty good, even though the seppa sticks out on both sides on the tsuba, meaning the seppa is not custom made for the pedestal on the tsuba, which is alright because these are fairly budget-friendly swords. What's interesting about this is the seppa is made of copper, but the habaki is brass. And this is a pretty common practice. I just don't know why. Why not have some consistency? Not a big deal, it just looks a little weird. I would prefer having a copper habaki as well to be consistent with the color of the copper seppa. The tsuba is very interesting. Not your common floral style longquan tsubas. It has a rim, which is true to historical tachis. Very nice. It also has a unique shaping of the outer rim on the tsuba. What's interesting is that the Fushikashira style is the later period katana or uchi katana style mounting. So paired with this saya, which is very typical for uchi katana style katanas, it's basically a katana style sword with the edge facing upward. Now, this is kind of weird to have a tachi style tsuba. Does it make a handachi? I can't really tell, but it's a little awkward. And even though the tsuba features a very unique tachi style and many geometries, the casting quality is fine. It's blackened brass, and you can already see some part of the brass turns yellow again, which is all right. It has an antique look, I suppose. But having this amount of geometry on the tsuba, especially on this side, which interact with your hand, means that often when you handle a sword, your finger rub into the inside of the tsuba with these sharp edges on these geometries of flowers. It just feels a little awkward. Although when you do test cutting, it's not very pronounced as you focus mostly on the target and your techniques. So that's okay. And look at the transition to the fuchi and kashira. Pretty flush, no ledges sticking out, no hot spot, which is nice. Again, the tsuka is very much axe handle, even though, like I said, it has this very distinct curve. Obviously, crafting a wooden core and do the same wrapping for a deeply curved handle is challenging, so I can appreciate that. However, it just doesn't have a lot of tapering in the profile. Also, like other swords, it's extremely girthy. Pretty wide, pretty thick. Although it's not to the point that it's ungrippable, it's still fine, especially when you put two hands on the grip. It just, if you want to use this in one hand, it's a little hard for retention. Overall, I'll say that the shaping is fine. I wish it has a little bit more tapering and the circumference be reduced a little bit. And the same panels are also not inlaid to the tsuka core as much as I can tell, even though it doesn't really stick out on either side and I can't see any wood. And also the cotton ito wrapping is fairly well done. There you have alternating patterns and they're pretty tight. You can't really move the knots around. Diamonds are pretty even, so this is pretty well done. It shows the level of fit and finish on their swords. And noticeable thing is it has only one makuki pin, bamboo, made of bamboo. So this means that it has a shortened tan than the standard katanas, which partially explains why the point of balance is so forward out. It's not extreme, it's still around 5 inches from the hilt. It's just not the most nimble sword you can handle. Also, this very curved handle means that you just really want to be careful when you swing the sword. Sometimes you get carried away and this blade just slash forward, carries the tsuka, especially pommel end of the tsuka, right into your forearm, and you don't want that. When I did the test cutting, once this pommel drove directly into my forearm. Now, obviously, if you use your offhand to hold on to the end of the tsuka, and you naturally would swing the blade so that the handle rests on the side of your arm. Still, you just want to be careful. You don't want to overextend, do these hyperextension, and you want to keep the tsuka mostly at an angle from your forearm. Of course, that reduces the reach comparing to a straight bladed sword. As you can see, you can fully extend without the fear of the hilt furniture interfering with your forearm, and you have much better reach. I guess that's the trade-off you have with a curved sword. Now the same panels are pretty flat, and they might have something to do with the width of the tsuka. For edge alignment, that's great. Although it's a little thick. Well, like on some handweight swords, they're wide, but they're pretty thin, so you still get a good edge alignment. This one's edge alignment is not bad, but it's still unnecessarily thick. Overall, it's still a pretty good hilt mounting. It definitely works for practical purposes. Among all 3 of these swords, the Musashi ring katana is my least favorite. Now let's first look at the positives. Again, the leather ito wrapping on this blade is extremely nice. It just gives you better traction than silk and cotton. As leather, it doesn't fray as silk and cotton do, so that's a bonus. And you see the transition to the Fuchikashira is pretty flush, no ledges. The casting quality on the Fuchikashira is pretty crisp. You can make out the pattern of bamboo mat. I suppose that suits the overall zen feeling of the sword with a Musashi ring. And Fuchikashira and the tsuba are antiqued, or also made of brass. But on the tsuba, you can already see some antiquing being rubbed off, and the original yellowy brass color showing up again. Both the habaki and the seppa are made of brass, just very standard. The seppa also sticks out on one side of the tsuba pedestal to receive the seppa. Not egregious, but you can still feel it, especially when you have this hollow ring. If you accidentally stick your finger in there, it can really catch on to the seppa and just either chip your fingernail or something. Between the habaki and the blade, there's virtually no gap at all, and it's fitted very well. Also, we know that this Musashi ring style of tsuba has the least amount of counterweight in the hilt. Now, it's already above your hand, so it's not like at the pommel. You really need some good amount of counterweight to the blade. You have the tsuba. With a blade this beefy, have a Musashi ring, I just don't know. It doesn't feel very lively. The point of balance is pretty out there, 5.5 inches from the hilt. Also, this metal heavy feeling makes the sword a little clumsy. The mounting of the tsuba raised the question of the integrity of this hilt. You see, there's a little bit of wiggling, and you can listen to its rattly sound. By the way, these three swords from RVA Katana went to the YouTuber Kingfisher first. Check out his channel for the awesome cutting footage there. When Kingfisher received the swords, the wiggle in the tsuba was already there. And curiously, just like I showed you earlier in this video, I did some abusive testing on a tree trunk, and that didn't really loosen up the tsuba further. And the tsuba on the other two swords are solid. The other thing confirmed by Kingfisher is that the edges on all three swords came dull, and none of his testings altered the sharpness in any way. And I did do additional sharpening on all three swords prior to the cutting. It was easy enough to sharpen the two swords with deep Sori, but the straighter katana with a Musashi ring was a challenge indeed, given how thick the blade is, especially in the bottom half, causing my sharpening to scuff off the blades here and there. Now the sharpness I put on were indeed adequate. And here's the thing, the Cloudhammer medieval longsword RVA Katana sent me also had somewhat dull edges, and I had to sharpen it too. So you see, this is a consistent problem at Cloudhammer. Now, the fit and finish is rather nice. Like I said, leather ito wrapping is well done with very uniform diamonds, alternating knots, patterns. But this one's different, featuring two Mekubi pins and made of not organic material, probably some polypropylene. They also have some nice geometries, not like your standard chopstick. Two pins, meaning that this 10 is longer, and that explains the higher weight on the sword. Having a synthetic material for Mekubi pins probably contributes to the overall durability. You can also see the same traits on the same panel here. They don't seem to be inlaid into the suka core. The same is lacquered, so there's nothing to see here. Also completely black. You can see the manuki on this hilt is rather unique. Overall, the leather-wrapped tsuka is pretty comfortable to hold on to. And this one also has a little bit of hourglass geometry tapering in the tsuka. It's mostly straight, so it's fairly easy to maneuver. It just, like I said, for the other two swords, could be less girthy. On these two swords with leather ito wrapping, you also can feel the geometric transition to the tip. The yokote has a transition in the geometry, and not just a different polishing direction. As on this one, there's no geometric yokote, and you feel just like a smooth transition, and the yokote is a fake one that's achieved by using a different direction of polishing. Another trait of all three of these swords is that the mune, or the spine of the sword, is actually not the thickest part. The thickest part of this entire blade is actually the shinogi-ji. And this feature is found on many antique Japanese swords that are not usually replicated by modern reproductions. And you can say that indeed have a grind to thin out from the shinogi-ji to the spine is a little bit more difficult, especially you have to do this throughout the entire blade. So that is definitely more unique to the standard regular Chinese katanas. But the downside of this feature is that all three of these swords are rather silent. They're not just quiet on some swords without bohi. They don't make a lot of sword wind sound when you swing them to give you audible feedback. On these, they're practically silent. I can almost get zero sound from swinging it. Especially this Musashi ring sword, it just doesn't have any noise at all. Now, it might not matter to you that much, but when you train with the sword, you really want something you can hear, audible feedback to assist with your training. So that's something to keep in mind of. Obviously, this one with a white bohi does have some sword wind sound, not very pronounced still. The saya for all three katanas have a distinctive taper in the thickness, which corresponds well to the distal taper of the blades. By the way, the saya of the Musashi katana has buffalo horn, koryugata, koryuguchi, and kojiri. They have this very bright amber color that's opaque. It reminds me of very bold lager, so quite attractive. Good choice of material. The other two sayas don't have buffalo horn components. They are simply lacquered wood with ichime stonewash texture, which is okay. They showcase the deep Sori very well. I only wish that these two deep Sori katanas could have touchy style koshirai, which will highlight their distinctive geometries. Now, after examining these three swords, I can confidently say they offer quite a bit for the asking price, $400 to $500. You get a Su-hardened blade using tried and true steel with adequate heat treatment. It's extremely durable while being able to hold an edge. They can carry rare geometries, such as deep Sori and extra distal taper, to have distinct handling characteristics from the typical reproduction katanas you find in the entry and mid-range of the market. Of course, you can upgrade further to use their S5, S7 shock steel, or their SKS3 Japanese tool steel that has superior edge retention, or some of their more traditionally made, differentially hardened Damascus or folded steel. On top of that, judging from these three swords, we know that katanas at Cloudhammer Steelworks have excellent fit and finish. Not perfect, there's something to be improved. The wiggle on one of the tubas and the lack of sharpness have to be rectified. Good thing is that you can always contact their customer representatives to specify your needs, to have custom commissions using one-off fittings, using more exotic steel types, having unique blade geometries, or certain historical proportions or dimensions. These are all possible if you contact Nangong Chang'an on Facebook. Link in the description down below. If you enjoy this video, find any value or entertainment, please like and subscribe.